There we go. Okay, good. Scroll down. Here. 0.5. Follow you all the way back. Full screen. And then there we go. And there. That's what I want. Marvel Strike Force. I haven't seen that before. Not because. Okay, there we go. Lovely. Good. Good. And then that over here. Default screen.
I believe blessing plays a significant role in God's plan of redemption in that blessing is the goal of God's plan of redemption. Oftentimes when we think about God's redemptive work, we can theologically kind of divide it up into different areas or different subjects or ideas. So we can talk about the atonement. We can talk about Jesus' cross work. We can talk about justification. We can talk about growing in holiness. We can kind of pick up these theological topics. And if we want to think, okay, how does blessing fit into that kind of systematic discussion of redemption or what God is doing to redeem his people? I think ultimately blessing is what God has been working to ever since the beginning. From Genesis chapter 1 to Revelation 22, God's redemptive work has been bringing his people into a place of experiencing his blessing, but also mediating his blessing. Right? So as Christians today, when we think about God's redemptive work in our lives, we're not just the recipient of God's blessing. We are that for sure. But Scripture also calls us to live lives that bless others so that we become a channel of blessing to the world, or that we become as lights shining in the darkness, as a city set on a hill. That God's goodness is not for us to just absorb like a sponge, but in fact it is to be displayed as God's people live lives that bless others.
Okay, yeah, good.
We have a saying in my city that I hear all the time. It comes up in conversation whenever you're chatting with somebody and there's a mutual pain point in life. The saying is, the struggle is real. I was in traffic for an hour, the struggle is real. Winter is dragging on and on, the struggle is real. Underneath that popular cliche is a dark comedy over the fact that life, as good and rich as it is full of suffering and pain. No matter how much money you make or success you achieve, no life is up and to the right nonstop. At times, it is just a struggle to keep on. Jesus said as much. In John's Gospel, Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble. Will have trouble. Not are likely to, or it's theoretically possible. No, you will have trouble. Jesus and the New Testament writers go on to command us, all through the New Testament, to rejoice, meaning to choose joy. Why? It's an odd command, right? A command to be happy? Because in this world, suffering is inevitable, but joy is not. Of course, all sorts of wise teachers differentiate between pain and suffering. Pain is what is, the death of a loved one, or a diagnosis, or a divorce, or a failure, or a betrayal that you just can't shake. Suffering is how we feel about what is, and the meaning we make or we don't make from it. Psychologists define neuroticism as when we suffer more than we need to. By that definition, a lot of us are neurotic. We suffer more than we need to, in large part because we expect life to be easy. M. Scott Peck, if you're familiar with him, in his best-selling book, The Road Less Traveled, opens with this very simple line, life is difficult. And then he goes on for a few pages just to argue that when you expect life to be easy, it's really hard, and you suffer and feel pain. But when you expect life to be hard, for the most part, in a counterintuitive way, it's very good, and you are, not always, but a lot of the time, full of joy. And nowhere is this more true than in the spiritual life. Spirituality is a kind of struggle for our soul. Now, our generation is very uncomfortable with struggle in general and military metaphors and faith in particular, and for good reason if you've ever read church history. But the New Testament authors do not share our kind of fear of that metaphor. Over and over, they liken following Jesus not only to a struggle, but to a kind of war for the soul. Paul, the most prolific writer in the New Testament, says, fight the good fight of faith, a famous line. He also writes, put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. He's very careful to note that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil. And he goes on to say, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world, and we have divine power to demolish strongholds. That's all like rife military imagery from the ancient world. If you know your church history, you know there's an ancient stream of the church that developed around the spirituality of struggle and even spiritual war. It started with the desert fathers and mothers. The 3rd and 4th centuries were a defining moment for the church, the global church, not just the Western church. On one hand, Emperor Constantine, if you know your history, legalized the way of Jesus, or what by the 2nd century had come to be called Christianity, and the church kind of lost its prophetic edge. It began more and more to compromise with Rome and become complicit in a system that at times was very unchristian. On the other hand, Rome, the empire, was in decline and disarray, and it felt like the world was falling apart at the seams. Thousands of followers of Jesus, as a response to this kind of cultural moment, gave up a, quote, normal life and moved out to the deserts of Egypt or Syria to devote their entire life to God in prayer. One such desert father was a hero of mine, a man named Evagrius Ponticus, also known as Evagrius the Solitary, which is pretty great. He was a wealthy intellectual from Constantinople in what is now Turkey, who abandoned his life of privilege for the desert of Egypt and just, again, gave his whole life over to prayer. In time, he became a sought-after spiritual guide and healer for the soul that other monks and nuns and followers of Jesus would come from all over the ancient Mediterranean to sit at his feet and sit under his teaching. His writings have survived as some of the most brilliant theology of the ancient church. My favorite is a book by his called